You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 272 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, some pretty bleak news. We had this resolution, H-Con Res 138, that was working its way through the House of Representatives. Had this thing passed, it would have been a huge step forward in getting the United States to end support for the Saudi-led coalition's genocidal war against the people of Yemen. And, this could have potentially been a bill that just completely ended the war. However, through some pretty dark and undemocratic processes, House leadership killed that bill. So I'm going to detail all of that on today's show and why the situation in Yemen is just so important. All right, to share this show, check out a couple places. The Libertarian Institute, where you could find this show and my daily news roundup and a lot of other great libertarian content there. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. And of course, the show's on a bunch of different podcatchers and all that kind of stuff like iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio. And if you're there and listening to the show, go ahead and give me a rating and review. There's one other note that I'll make before I actually get into the content here on today's show. When I started, producing content, I did it on a personal site of mine, kylesfilesblog.com. It's actually been 3 years since I started that site. And I'm shutting it down. Really don't need it anymore, so that's no longer going to be available. If you are one of the last few remaining people who still got their news round up there, don't worry, it's still available. Just go to libertarianinstitute.org to find it there, or of course my news website that I have been using for the past year, immersionnews.com, where you can find all the great links and stories that I post everywhere else. Definitely check that out. On Facebook, the page that I have used, from the start was Kyle's Files. I don't have a whole lot of lights on it or anything like that, but I know that there are still some of you who check out that page to get the daily news roundup and the different episodes of Foreign Policy Focus. I am going to keep that going for now, but by the end of the year, I'm just pretty much going to stop posting on Facebook. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with the Foreign Policy Focus group. I'll probably keep my Facebook account so I could keep the group or something like that. But really, I want to switch my social media presence over to this new social network, Minds. Check out an episode of Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast. It was pretty recent, probably 175, where Mans actually interviews the host, the founder and creator of Minds.com. And, they talk about why that site is just so much better. To be honest, sharing on Facebook probably doesn't get the show out to new people, and they're unlikely to click on it, but I have been able to, build my audience a little bit, just in the, kind of short weeks here that I'm using mine. So I highly check that out, for anybody who's thinking about abandoning Facebook and Twitter and all the other junk anyways. And, this is kind of I think a new social network site that has a lot of, a very, very high upside. All right, but now, of course, the most important thing is Yemen. Now, this story is really going to sound unbelievable. So, for those of you who don't believe me, I'm actually going to link to the bill itself in the page. This H-Res, so House Resolution 1142. So what happened here is you had this House Bill 1142. And what this bill is meant to do is, I think, take the gray wolf off the endangered and threatened species list for another year. And there's 3 sections to this bill. It's only about a page long. I mean, you could read this bill start to finish and kind of understand the whole thing. Sections 1 through 3 deal with the gray wolf, and then we get to section 4. And in a single sentence, this says that section 7 of the War Powers Act does not apply to H-Con Res 138. And of course, H-Con Res 138 is a bill that I've been plugging on the show for the past couple weeks. And what this does is it invokes the War Powers Act to end the U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition's war on Yemen. And then this passes and gets put on the actual bill, because, this is an amendment situation, by the House leadership on a 6-2 vote. And, I don't know if anybody even knew this was happening. You know what I mean? It's not like I saw any articles on it ahead of time. It was probably pretty quickly placed on the bill. to alter and all that kind of stuff. But then the next day, the General House votes, and it's about 200 to 180 or so, like a 20 vote split in favor of passing this resolution. And so, at first this seems almost cartoonish. I once saw an episode of The Simpsons where Krusty the Clown gets elected to, go to Washington or Capital City, I think. And, is supposed to be changing some law and gets corrupt. But anyways, at the end, basically what he does is he attaches the bill that he once passed onto, a completely separate bill that's in no way related. Like the whole scheme is, he gets up there and paper clips it in the middle of the night and it ends up passing. And that's essentially what we have happening here. We have House leadership smuggling this into the bill. So it's not even an actual vote on the Yemen War or anything like that. It's not like there's any debate happening now about what's going on in Yemen. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit because it's extremely important. But, essentially what you have is the House leadership sneaking in a little end run around the War Powers Act, which was supposed to be, a law that strengthened and clarified the constitutional war powers divide between the president and the Congress. Something that we have, anybody who listens to this show, I'm sure is aware that, the president's war powers have absolutely run rampant and are in no way in control or in line with the Constitution or anything that could even resemble not a huge usurpation of congressional powers. The clearest example of this is, trying to use the 2001 NDAA in places like Somalia, where, the Al-Shabaab group didn't even form until like 2009 there, that they're alleged terrorist organization, that were, using this to fight. And they've not, they're not people that carry out these international terrorist attacks. They're fighting for regional territory. They control southern Somalia. They're not like the international jihadist Al-Qaeda, bin Laden followers of a couple hundred that there were on 9/11. These aren't the same people. It's not the same ideology. And it's not even in the same continent as Afghanistan. It's literally on the other side of the Middle East from Afghanistan. And this is a place where, the President Obama, President Trump are using a law that was passed in the days right after, the 9/11 terror attacks that said, we give the president the authority to go after the people who perpetrated 9/11, so bin Laden and his followers, and the people who protected them, meaning the Taliban. It's absolute insanity, right? Now, to get into the weeds a little bit here on what's going on, Section 7 of the War Powers Act is the one that basically makes it a privileged motion. They say that, if this is brought to the floor, it must receive a full vote in like 15 days, and there, I think, has to be some slotted amount of debate time, which, these kind of things are really important, because this would give somebody like a Thomas Massey or a Tulsi Gabbard to stand up there and say that this war is criminal, it's killing innocent people every single day. Right now, there's some poor Yemeni baby that has spent, the first, 3 years of its life barely struggling to survive hunger pains all day long. And then finally, because the bridge that linked their town to the, next town over was destroyed by Saudi Arabia, the people there were able to get that much less food. This kid's gonna finally starve to death. Or, some other poor little kid who is, gonna be the victim of, cholera or some other kind of medical condition that's easily treatable, that he could easily get help for if Saudi Arabia and the Houthis who they're fighting against would stop blowing up all the medical facilities, but this is mostly done by Saudi Arabia and their bombing campaign. But they're not going to get the ability to say that because they stripped H-Con Res 138 of, this portion of the War Powers Act. So basically, now they never have to bring it up for a vote. You would think that this, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but this seems dubious to me as far as, the legality of it. Can you just have one bill pass, the House that is only directed at, a small portion of a different law that's a clarification of the Constitution? It seems really a stretch. Now, my guess would be is that people who support this bill and who had any idea where Yemen is at all would say that they don't believe that the U.S. intervention in Yemen is sufficient to rise to the level of, military action that the president would need congressional authorization for. And so this is a perfect time to discuss what the U.S. role is in supporting the Saudi-led coalition. The first thing is this mid-air refueling that's actually just now recently ended. This has been going on for the first 3.5 years of the Yemen War. where U.S. KC-130s would take off, I think mostly from the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey and, fly over Yemen, and I guess the territorial waters around Yemen and provide mid-air refueling to these Saudi jets so they could hover above, Yemeni cities for hours at a time and, conducting airstrikes that, as, I've discussed in the past on the show, are absolutely, at best, they're indiscriminate, but more likely they seem intentionally to be targeting civilian infrastructure. So imagine, you're one of the poor people who, happen to have, been born in Yemen and, now your life's absolutely miserable because you live there and you live under this terrible blockade and air war. You have to go hours at a time with Saudi jets, flying above your city. You hear them knowing they could drop their bombs anywhere. And that, in fact, that, they may bomb your house because they want to, make your neighbors afraid and they want to make your people say, we give up. We don't want to fight anymore. Screw this. Servitude and slavery to the Saudis are better than this indiscriminate air campaign that could kill us at any hour of the day. And I mean, there's really no limit. They've bombed cholera facilities. They've bombed funerals, weddings, factories, the cereal production factories, which is key to Yemen. They've bombed the farmers, the coffee growers, the beekeepers. They've bombed the ports. They bombed the markets. They bombed the soccer stadiums. They bombed the schools. They bombed the roads. They bombed the bridges. Everything is a target for them. Now, I guess the Saudis have gained the ability to provide mid-air refueling to their own aircraft, or maybe they've gotten some third government to do it instead of the United States. And so, very unfortunately, the U.S. didn't pull the rug out under from Saudi Arabia years ago before they had the ability to do it on their own and, basically coddled them the whole way until they, gained this ability. Next, the U.S. provides maintenance on the Saudi F-16s and other bombers that they use to blow up Yemen. I'm not sure, maybe they would be able to repair their airplanes in other ways, but we certainly don't have to help them to do this. We provide targeting and logistical support. This is something that actually opens the United States up to being potential victims of war crimes because we're helping to select the targets. It's very interesting that we would remain a part of a targeting process for so long that has caused such catastrophe and so much human suffering in Yemen. And the argument they keep saying is, well, it would be worse if we weren't involved. But as Martha Mundy pointed out, and this is an episode of the Scott Horton Show, and I'll link to it in the show notes page, they're waging a food war, right? Like the air campaign is specifically targeted against the food production capabilities of Yemen to make sure that they starve to death. And if, the Saudis are able to eliminate their homegrown food production and then they're able to blockade Yemen from the outside, they could completely control and enslave the Yemeni people to do whatever they want. They say, if you want food, you must act the way we say. The United States, and this is something that wouldn't necessarily change whether the War Powers Act was invoked or not, provides a lot of diplomatic cover to Saudi Arabia. So a country, let's say Iran, was maybe acting belligerently to one of its neighbors, or not even, or Russia, the U.S. would look to condemn them at the United Nations as well as the rest of the international community. And this hasn't happened in the Saudi war. Part of it is that for anything meaningful to come out of the UN, it has to go through the Security Council, and the United States is one of the 5 permanent member states and can veto any resolution. The UK is also a permanent member state, and while I haven't really focused on the UK role on this show, the UK has a significant role as well in supporting that Saudi coalition. The weapon sales are, again, one of the most important things that goes on here. Saudi Arabia will have run out of bombs now had we not continued to restock and resupply them. And the reason this is important is because when the people of Yemen, go to their funeral home or go to the smoldering wreckage of the school bus where 40 plus children were blown to pieces, the fragments of the bombs aren't in Arabic. They're in English. They're, they say Lockheed Martin on them, the M80 or whatever other kind of bomb. And so, just kind of let that sink in is that, from, I guess, the perspective of especially the Yemenis, I mean, what else could they say? They're American-made planes that fly overhead, and then they're American-made bombs that drop on their heads and blow up their children. It would be pretty hard, I think, from their position to not blame the Americans for some of this. Supporting the blockade is also just massively important here. Saudi Arabia has a pretty limited and pretty old navy. Now, I know they've bought some ships recently and have a lot of purchase orders in for others, especially from European ship-making companies. However, who knows, because Yemen is kind of right on the other side of the Red Sea from Djibouti and Somalia. So I think it would, it seems to me be possible to have like a lot of smuggling into the country and stuff like that if you had a couple different situations, which was the American Navy wasn't also enforcing the blockade, which is, of course, the Navy that asserts the right to control pretty much any body of water larger than a football field anywhere on Earth, and, the right to travel through and do what it pleases in it. So, it's these American ships that are helping to enforce the blockade that, sends these aid ships that are full of food and fuel for the Yemeni people to Saudi ports, sometimes several times to get inspected. A lot of times the food products actually end up going bad before they even reach Yemen because the inspections regime of the Saudis is so intrusive and oppressive. This is a great topic of discussion on a Scott Horton Show interview with Scott Paul. And so I'll link to that one on the show notes page as well to better understand kind of the nuances of the blockade. A lot of times I just call it a blockade. I think, if you're looking at a technical definition, it really isn't. It's not like are not allowing any ship to reach Yemen. It's just they're making it logistically impossible for them to do so. So it's, a de facto blockade may be a better term. You also have the fact that Saudi Arabia blows up a lot of boats out there in the Red Sea with airstrikes. They drop bombs on fishermen. That's another thing that's absolutely insane is, they blow up fishermen out there. But then, I guess that could apply too if somebody was trying to smuggle goods into Yemen. They would just blow up the boat. So, this is absolutely insane support that the United States is giving Saudi Arabia here. Saudi Arabia doesn't have much of a ground force, and in fact has, since they picked a war with the Houthis, have actually had some Houthi incursions into southern Saudi Arabia, because, they're border states there. Now, Saudi Arabia has, I think, finally, along with the UAE, been able to muster an army, kind of compiled of Sudanese mercenaries, Yemenis, who I think are mostly fighting because, they're poor and starving, and so the only way to get food and money, is to join the army. So there's a lot of people joining up for that reason. And then Al-Qaeda and ISIS members who have been rolled into that fighting force as well. And so it does seem that they finally have some ground presence now, but largely, they don't have much of a ground force, which means they're just fighting an air war. And, the results are absolutely disgusting. I know the hardest part about this is that it's so terrible. It really does sound unbelievable. You wouldn't think that it could be this bad. And also the fact that it empowers Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It's not even within U.S. interest to be doing this to the Yemeni people. In fact, the reason that the U.S. even started supporting this war, and this is according to the Obama administration under which, we started supporting the Saudis in 2015, is that we were doing this to placate Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia was concerned about the U.S. moving closer to Iran after Obama signed and entered the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear agreement. So now we have, the U.S. wrapped up in this war for the nuclear agreement, and the nuclear agreement Trump has withdrawn from, which just adds to the, insanity and, like a tragic comedy kind of sorts of situation here where you sign a nuclear agreement with a country, but you had to kind of swallow this really nasty bad pill along with it. And then the good thing you get goes away. And so now you're only stuck with the bad, horrible genocidal war. You're not even, really improving U.S. and Iranian relations and taking war with that country off of the table anymore. And, that part of it is all Donald Trump's fault. The withdrawal from the JCPOA is inexcusable. And, at the very least, I guess Trump could have ended this war in exchange, but obviously that's not happening. And, it doesn't seem like this could be any worse. It's a tragedy that everyone who was paying attention saw coming. Everybody said Yemen imports a large percentage of its food, mainly because of, international loans and pressures coming into the country and, different U.S. and other world power aid programs and stuff like that. Push Yemen not to produce their own food, but rather engage in things like beekeeping and growing coffee, which I guess kind of on the international market are more profitable. It may even be better for the Yemeni people, unless of course they're blockaded and starving to death. because they don't have their own food to eat then. And of course, Saudi Arabia, by blowing up grain silos even, or, farm equipment, has basically made it impossible even, I guess, 3 years in, maybe you start to develop and cultivate some crops again. That's not happening. And, it looked like, I think I was starting to get pretty optimistic that we were going to have at least a political solution to the United States involvement here. That Congress and the Senate, that this war is too sick, it's too tragic, even for a bunch of people taking money from the weapons makers that are the only ones benefiting from this war, would have to just, be disgusted by it and say no. But, I guess that's not the case. Or, they just kind of changed the legislation enough to make sure it never actually comes to a vote. But at the same time, people don't have to listen, as I said, to like Reps Massey and Amash and Gabbard and others. Barbara Lee, I give her some credit there, to get up there and say that this is absolutely wrong and horrific. Maybe the Democrats will make a political issue out of it. I don't know. It'd be really nice to see, not holding my breath there. I'm not sure what's going to happen. There's also SJ Res 54, I believe, and this is the War Powers Act on the Senate side. So, maybe we could still hope to see this advance through the Senate. Another thing about Yemen I want to mention is that this isn't even the only war in Yemen. This is a war that's mostly in like kind of the western third of Yemen. But in the rest of Yemen, it's rural Sunni tribal territory. And, especially with the lack of the central government in Yemen because of the war, you have ISIS and Al-Qaeda taking quite a bit of territory. These groups are mostly tied together in Yemen. I haven't seen a lot of stories of any like violence between them, and they mostly, I guess, remain allies or, kind of just different branches of one organization. At times, they've held very important places in Yemen, like the port of Makala. Now, again, we had to go back to the Obama years in 2009 here to understand that Obama and his drone czar, John Brennan, started engaging in a drone war against Yemen. I think Bush carried out a drone strike there in 2004, but really it starts in 2009 under Obama. And a bunch of people, civilians included, end up getting killed by these drones that hover there all day long and, rain missiles down on people when they think they got one of the bad guys in their sights. I think abstractly looking at numbers like the Obama administration carried out 500 drone strikes and 8 organizations were able to confirm that over 300 people, civilians, were killed in those strikes. It's kind of boring it in. Doesn't really make people understand really what happens here. So there is a story, I believe it's in the Miami Herald. I'll link to it in the show notes page. And this story is of a 14-year-old boy who lives in Yemen. His parents send him out to get some goods for the family. And he meets up with his buddy, and his buddy says, "Hey man, you really want a motorcycle? I hear Al-Qaeda is giving away motorcycles a couple towns over." The boy doesn't have any interest to, join Al-Qaeda, but any of us who are, at least, I'm sure a 14-year-old human being or older, or, especially a 14-year-old boy, remember back to that time. Somebody says free motorcycles, it really doesn't matter who's giving those away. That sounds pretty interesting and cool. And, something like, worth taking a little adventure for. And I guess it's kind of known too that Al-Qaeda will do things like this where they, try like increase favorability among the population, and, giving toys to kids is a pretty good way to, gain some popularity and be seen in a good light by the coming generation. So the boys end up going, a couple towns over, and, the kid doesn't tell his parents. And, he ends up, at that night at ISIS camp. And, in the story, very interesting, the two boys, this kid and his friend, the center of the story, actually, end up sleeping outside in a ditch because, they say it's safer than sleeping, in a tent where you could possibly be mistaken for Al-Qaeda. So the fact that this is just like common knowledge among many people, that sometimes it's safer to sleep outside in a hole, pretty much in a grave, than sleeping indoors in a house. I mean, the fact that this is the norm in Yemen should be extremely enlightening to the problems with the U.S. drone war. Rewinding a few hours, the boy's parents notice he isn't coming home and they get concerned. They find out, more or less what's happened, that, the boy's headed there. The wife, very concerned for her husband and her older son's safety as they kind of go out to, start to look for these boys. She, says, don't be out traveling at night. And, it's not because of gangs of thugs are going to come get them. It's because of U.S. drones are going to come get them and blow them up. The family travels a couple towns over. They I guess, encounter a family of beekeepers who are just, honest, normal working guys. But they at least have some relatives that know some guys who are in Al-Qaeda. So they're able to like kind of go approach the group and, ask to let these kids come home. So, kind of against what's probably their better judgment, they decide to go out at night because, these are two young boys who are now in the hands of Al-Qaeda and, parents really want their kids back. And you could hear this through their voices the whole way through. In the article is that, they knew it was a bad idea to go out, but, what parent anywhere, any parent that go ask them, say, your kid's missing at night. Are you sleeping? Are you waiting till morning? Even if it's dangerous for you to go out and, walk the streets or drive around and look for your child. So, they go out in a car and they kind of get to the base of the mountain of the Al-Qaeda encampment and, their car is blown up by a drone strike. After a drone strike hits the Al-Qaeda encampment as well, the boys, kind of go down the mountain and find there, what's the one boy's father's car and a smoldering pile of rubble. And, I guess the boys didn't see, but 7 people in total died, all innocent civilians, just good people going out of their way mostly, to find a couple young boys who made a bad decision. And so, I hope a story like this, maybe in a little bit of a different way from some of the more dry statistics overall talking about the drone program, is maybe a story that, we could use to spread this message because it's so important. And, we need to stop the war against the Houthis, because the people of Yemen need to eat, and Saudi Arabia is going to starve them to death with our help if we do nothing. And maybe even if we, do everything, and we stop helping Saudi Arabia completely, it may not be enough to save all those people. But it may save a couple even. And so that, there's no reason not to stop that war. But then we also have to stop this drone war against, a lot of the other people of Yemen and, make it so that kids could grow up in a much more normal way and not be terrified and sleep in holes in the middle of the night and people being afraid to drive around at night because who knows who's going to be mistaken for Al-Qaeda and blown up. I actually had some other stuff to say, but I've already gone on quite a bit here and the next couple stories will take a while to get into. So I'll save them for Monday, especially since Wednesday's show I know was really long, but man, I think Joanne Leon did a great job explaining all that stuff. So if you haven't listened to 271, I would go back and do that over the weekend. And I hope everybody's enjoying the show. Any kind of feedback you got, let me hear it. If you really like it and you want to, be more supportive, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Like I said, I'm adding some goodies in. I have my original articles. I wrote about 20 or so way back about 3 years ago. Actually, a couple on Yemen that aren't too bad. So those will be available there. I have a document that I'm creating that's actually going to have all the news roundups I've done all together there in like one gigantic couple 100-page long Word document. So if you want access to that, you can find that at patreon.com as well. Hopefully in the next week or two, I'll have that up and out available for all of you who want to donate to the show. And I'm thinking about doing maybe like a little thing called Immersion News Radio or something like that, where once a week or once every other week I spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about stories that aren't related to foreign policy, prohibition stuff, drug war stuff, bank gamesters who steal all of our money, all that kind of good stuff I could talk about on that show. Let me know if you kind of want that stuff, and that would, incentivize you to donate to me and, help the cause. Also share the show, libertarianinstitute.org, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, Twitter at KYAAALE, but, place to go to, minds.com/immersion news. Check that out. Subscribe to the channel. There's an anti-war group there that I'm a part of, and I really try to push people over there to talk about the anti-war movement and message. So hope y'all are enjoying it. Let me know. Talk to you later.